And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO at Thought Leadership Leverage. And you're joining us on the podcast, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, my guest is David Bell. David's really interesting. He's a trailblazer in e-commerce. He is the founder of a company called Idea Farms. He is an academic that's been published all over. And he's an investor. And some of the companies that he's invested in, you've probably heard of because they're direct-to-consumer brands like Bonobos and Diapers.com, Harry's, Warby Parker, Jet.com. So he knows a couple things about a couple of things. So welcome aboard, David. How are you?
Hey, good. Thanks, Peter. Good to be here.
So you're kind of hard to put into a category, right? We can say David is an academic. That is true. We can say David investor. That is true. We can say David's a CEO. That's true. But talk about, I guess, how the thought leadership has had a role in your work.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. No, I guess I was very fortunate to have a few different bites at the cherry, and I'm sort of by no means in this league, but one of the most interesting people I heard speak, it was a couple of years ago at a conference in Germany in Munich called Bits and Pretzels, and it's all the European sort of startups and tech founders
Mhm.
and so on. And it was coincident with Oktoberfest, so they decided on Sunday morning who are they going to put on the bill at 8 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday during Oktoberfest was actually Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I think one of the most interesting people you'll ever hear in terms of three totally different orthogonal careers, bodybuilder,
Yeah.
movie star, and then into governor of California, very high level politics. Now he's, of course, doing other stuff. So, yeah, I'm certainly nowhere near that league, but I think this idea of, a little bit of reinvention is not a bad thing. And I was very fortunate, to get to the United States as a student and go through the American academic system and teach.
Right.
And while teaching, got exposed to early stage consumer investing, which is a bit of a passion, and then kind of transitioned into doing that full time, but also retaining the academic interest. So I think we
Which
all live.
be there a minute because, when you think about what it takes to be a successful academic at the places you are, right? We're talking about significant, reputable places, and then to just sort of move over to the other side as an investor.
Right.
Most academics, quite frankly, I don't think have I don't say the courage, but maybe I'll say the courage to sort of take that leap because when you get to a certain level in academia, it's really comfortable. Like life's
Very
pretty good. You're
comfortable.
making decent money. You're doing what you love.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. And I think, in my particular case, I have a very good friend who sort of did it on the front end. He was a professor in finance at UCLA, did a few years, got married, and then he actually went straight into working as an investment banker, was very, very successful. And then by the time he got into his mid 30s, was effectively able to stop working, at least stop working for other people, but still continue to publish. So, he's really one of my best friends. And that was always very inspirational to me. I never thought I'd be able to carry off something like that. But I think what's happened, particularly post COVID, I mean, now we're in this AI world too.
Yeah.
Like a number of really good friends actually have left academia, left Harvard, left Wharton, left Cornell, and other really good places and gone to start companies. Some of them have sort of at least part time, sometimes full time,
Mhm.
worked in large corporates. So, Microsoft, Amazon,
Yeah.
Google, those kind of companies now have chief economists and scientists and people who fit naturally out of academia. So, one of my friends from Stanford, I mean, he was a chair professor at Stanford at the business school in a really
Yeah.
great role. And he actually also quit. Now he's a big shot at Google. So I think people are looking to do other stuff. And it's really a confluence of two things, I think, Peter. One is there's just so much more opportunity on the outside for people who've been through that academic training, because some of it can be potentially quite useful, number one. And number two, I think academia is also under a lot of pressure now, and it's not quite the
Yeah.
environment that maybe it was, right? There's all kinds of sources of education now. I'm taking a class on Coursera along with about 600,000 other people. So I think the traditional university, that model of, offline courses and very high fee,
Yeah.
tenured
Yeah.
professors, that's under a lot of threat. And if you look at where AI is going, one of the largest sectors that people think is going to evolve is the ed tech sector in
Yeah.
all kinds of forms. So I think it's a confluence of all that. It's still probably a small total number of people, but certainly much more common than it was, 10 years ago.
Interesting. So I want to talk about your thought leadership. You've published, you've got your own models, your methods, and your frameworks. And one of the cool things that I've learned from our conversation is the theoretical and the applied, right? So it's one thing to get up there and teach something, but you've now invested in companies that we all know, diapers and Jets.com and Warby and Harry. So obviously e-commerce, what are the models and the frameworks that you look at when evaluating one of these businesses? Because I would argue if you had one or two of those, I could say, maybe Dave is just a lucky fellow, right? I'm gonna go
Well, I think
with a little bit more than luck.
no, I think luck certainly factors into it too, right? You're just fortunate to be
Yeah,
around at places where there are good people. But I think, there's a couple of things that you look at. So one is, you look at whether there's an opportunity that's kind of a visceral thing that if you could improve upon it, would people take notice of that? So to take Warby Parker, very, very successful company, and in some ways emblematic of that whole space, Peter, the whole direct to consumer. If you go to Google and you type in Warby Parker there'll be a whole list of completions, including
right, right.
including Warby Parker of Coppins. So what they did is they said, like, people are paying a lot of money for glasses. There's no reason why they should be $300 other than you and I have got no idea who's making them. They're licensed
Sure.
to brands like Tiffany and Dolce and Gabbana, and they show up in stores, and that's just kind of what we're used to. The whole thing's opaque. Leslie Stahl did a really great 60 Minutes segment back in
Yep.
2012 kind of on this, right? So the first thing you look for is there sort of a structural problem with a sector or a product? People are getting ripped off, the product's substandard, diapers.com. You're stressed out, you're a young parent, you really want to go to the supermarket. Well, maybe not everyone does, right? And diapers, there's no surprise when it shows up. Pampers are Pampers. You're not going to be
Yeah.
shocked. It's not like buying bananas, online. So you look for that sort of visceral pain point, and then number two, you ask if it's ubiquitous, and then number three, you start to look at the tactical stuff. Do the people behind this idea have the right conception of brand, the right conception of go to market? Are they pricing for value? All of that blocking and tackling. So I think there's a statistic I remember from my academic days, very depressing. 90% of all ventures sort of tank and fail.
Sure.
But the majority that do, Peter, it's a failure of execution typically, more than a failure of conception. So sometimes people just have stupid ideas, like the Juicero, right? I don't know if you remember, that was like a terrible product. Somebody on YouTube went on with the juice bag and squeezed it, and it was kind of game over. So
Right.
sometimes there are just bad ideas, but I think oftentimes there are just great ideas with sort of bad execution or bad timing. So I'm old enough to remember when Webvan was around and it went out of business, but that's kind of come back. I remember a company called what the heck was it? They would deliver you a 6-pack of beer and
Cosmo. Cosmo.
exactly, Cosmo. Well, genius, right? And now you've got DoorDash and companies like that are worth tens of billions of dollars. So sometimes the idea is too early and it comes back. But I think that's what we're really looking at is this a team that can really execute against what seems to be a pretty fundamental idea?
If you're enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about our podcast, please leave a 5-star review at ratethispodcast.com/LTL and share it with your friends. We're available on Apple Podcasts and on all major listening apps, as well as at thoughtleadershipleverage.com/podcast. So I want to extrapolate from that, because in my work, right, I spend most of my time, or a good chunk of my time, developing strategies for thought leaders, right?
Yeah.
That's what I get paid to do, right? And I think that the reality is, I would say that we do a really good job at that. And I think our clients would say we do a good job at that. The execution is the problem. So it's not just in direct to consumer. Ideas are to some degree a dime a dozen, right? We should sit around with a couple of cocktails and come up with great ideas to change the world and do this and do that and whatever. But if all we do is wake up in the morning with a headache, that we didn't mean nothing happened there. And I think in the world of thought leadership, it's almost harder than in e-commerce CPG stuff, because at least with e-commerce here's, I'm holding up my Warbies, right? I've got 10 pairs of them. If the idea is let's build a pair of glasses for $100 that are stylish and fashionable and don't look cheap or whatever. Okay, well, this is a representation, this thing in my hand, of what that looks like. I can touch it, I can feel it, whatever. In the world of thought leadership, you can't put that idea in your hand, right? We could describe it, and we could talk about it, but you got to get it down to the level of detail that says, I'm going to take my ideas on X, whatever X might be.
Yep.
I'm going to put it into these modalities, a validated assessment tool, a video-based, whatever it is, and I'm going to deliver that at this price point to this market within this period of time. And I think a lot of thought leaders don't put that or don't apply that level of rigor to their businesses as someone like you, an investor, might. So have you seen that amongst your thought leader friends?
Yeah, a little bit. I think, I really love where you're going because there's a framework I sort of think about, very, very, very simple that I think speaks to some of these issues. Call it marketing math or business math 101, right? So it defines your success. And the success really is the interaction. It's not additive. It's like an interaction between, so how good is your product and then how good is your go to market? And it's a really simple exercise. But you think about, when the iPod first came out, I was in Boston in 2003. I'm riding on the T and I'm wearing the white headset and I'm listening to the dial, listening to the songs. People forget around the same time the Microsoft Zune came out as well. It was basically the same thing.
Yep.
But, one went on to enormous success, a company that's worth multiple trillions of dollars. Other companies successful too, but that product tanked. And the tanking is usually not to do necessarily with the quality of the product. I mean, if you build a zero, it's going to go to zero. But the other side of the equation, the marketing, can you position it properly? Can you go through the right channels? Can you price to value? Can you message it? And it's much harder to sort of reverse engineer a company that's been successful because of the nuances of positioning and go to market than it is a company that's been successful purely on the basis of a product. And I think, certainly in 2025, it's hard to be successful just purely on that dimension. So with respect to the thought leadership, having a simple idea, something of that nature that can be unpacked, that's got immediate tangible value. It's like, probably the most famous, at least of the last half century, more famous business academic would be Clay Christensen at Harvard Business School. Sadly, passed away. But think about some of his ideas, like jobs to be done or the innovator's dilemma. I mean, you could take that idea, you apply it to everything from the government to the military to an auto manufacturer to chip technology, right? I mean, the idea sort of is so fundamental that it's got one or two simple levers that if you actually drill down on them, you'll see success, and it's very tangible and very implementable.
I think that's true. And I also think a pattern that I see quite often with thought leaders is they're brilliant. Many of my clients are literally the best in the world or amongst the best in the world at what they do. However, when you get under the hood of their business, it could often be a mess. And I always scratch my head and say, well, why is that so? Why are these really smart people not sort of following the rules? And then I think about that and go, okay, well, this makes a lot of sense, right? Like if you and I were to sit around and say, we're gonna open a line of vegan pizza shops in college towns, and we want to put them next to marijuana dispensaries because that'll stimulate demand. That's going to be our model. We say, okay, that's kind of cute, right?
Yep.
We put together a business plan, blah, blah, blah. But ultimately, we have to sell that to the investors that says, okay, here's the branding, here's the positioning, here's the this, here's the ROI, here's what we're looking for in locations, and we're going to be in this sort of, college town in near Penn State, but we're not going to be near NYU because the real estate's a different structure, whatever. They're going to hold us to that. But thought leaders sometimes put themselves in a predicament where they're only accountable to themselves, and that's a bad thing, right?
Right.
Because we couldn't go back to our investors and say, okay, we took $10 million for you. Our idea was vegan pizza, college shop next to marijuana dispensaries. And 6 months later say, we had a different idea that we executed on. It's donuts next to Weight Watchers meetings.
Right. It's funny. It just made me think of another thing. Think about people whose work I admire who are thought leaders. I think there's sort of two other things that come to mind as well. This is obviously true of Clay Christensen, or you look at some of those other, really sort of big people. Is there's some real underlying research of substance to it? Like it's not just purely an idea, but there's empirical findings or facts. So you think about, The Long Tail by Chris Henderson. What a great idea. Like anyone who understands the internet's got to read that book, right? Why the future of business is buying less of more. There's more stuff, smaller volume, and all the nuances of that. Or, another person I really like is a former colleague and a friend at Wharton is Jonah Berger. He writes a lot about why things take off. And again, if you look at his work, there's always some like real empirical studies underneath. Like, why do certain articles get shared in the New York Times? Well, it can all be explained by this STEPS framework, S being social currency. I share things with you that make me look cool. And not only is the idea appealing and clever, but there's actually some real grunt work's been done underneath it. Even Michael Porter, the five forces,
That
I mean, to my recollection, he did real sort of industrial economics, nerd type papers that then led to
yeah, but
this
in,
more
in this
general framework.
market, I agree with what you're saying. However, in this market, I call it the sort of the steak and sizzle dilemma. There's a lot of folks out there on social that there's a lot of sizzle. They've got the charisma or the energy or the whatever it is, and it's magical. And whatever you want to believe what they say, right? Whether it's influencers, the thought leaders, or whatever. But if I were to say sell David a ruler, and the concept of the ruler is it measures 12 inches each and every time, but then you took it home and sometimes 12 inches was kind of 9 inches and sometimes 14. I'm going to be my reputation's gonna be hurt, and that's not gonna work all that long. So I think
Yep.
there's a space in the thought leadership world for that entertainment, feel good, motivational, pump it up, whatever. It's kind of the Peloton burst or a dopamine hit, you know?
That's right.
But I think you're right that the hard work and the things that just take time, that are held to, a research standard, an academic standard, etcetera, and then you build those other things on top of it. Not every Jonah Berger is a good example
Exactly.
of an academic that has a little bit I don't say he's, like, off the charts charisma, but he's got enough of it to bring it to life. When
Yep.
you think about some of the rock star academics and Adam Grant, I'd say Christensen as well, Michael Po there's some gravitas as well as presence.
Yes,
And
exactly.
I remember today
Exactly.
if a Clay Christensen was coming out today, would his stuff work on social? And I think probably not, because sometimes it takes more than 30 seconds to get a concept, and that's okay.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But and this could be just sort of a personal preference that's just been shaped by my own background. But I always have a lot of respect. Another one would be just a great guy, is a good friend of mine, Kevin Keller, up at
Yep.
Dartmouth, the Kotler and Keller textbook that Kevin came onto. And Kevin is basically the guy that came up with the concept of brand equity in in
Yeah.
the 90s. And so that's a really important practical idea. I mean, every company in the world thinks about that, but the underlying work that he did and what were the components of brand equity, how would one measure it, how would you leverage it? So to me, I think it's actually a great discussion, Peter. It's making me think about my own, way of constructing this, but
Right.
where it's the combination of it's accessible and it's understandable and implementable, but that it's kind of built on something pretty solid, So you pick up Kevin's book and would help you audit your brand and figure out how to extend it if that was something that you wanted to do. But in doing that, that he didn't out of his brilliant head pull all this stuff out. But he spent,
Right,
10
and
years
I think
doing
it's
serious research to get principles right.
yeah, and, you mentioned sort of the sharing of the New York Times articles. The 3 steps to lifetime success article is gonna do better than, "Here's the article that says you've gotta work really hard and really effort." Which article is gonna get
That's
shared
right.
more? Unfortunately, that's human nature, right? We're looking for the hack, we're looking for the easy way, we're looking for all that, and I think thought leadership, like everything else, you have to put in the reps, right? For it to be true, for it to be valid. This has been fantastic. What would you say as we sort of start to land the plane here, to someone that's out there today, that's where you might have been 15, 20 years ago? Rising
Yeah.
academic that's in the middle of things, thinking of going to the dark side. What
Right.
advice would you potentially give?
So my advice would be just to spend time with people who operate in the dark side. Go to some conferences that are industry
Yeah.
conferences. Get involved in. So when I was an academic, I would go to the management science conferences. It was great. You see all your colleagues, but really interesting work being done. But it's all of a very academic type. Whereas if you go to like a retail conferences, people who are actually in industry, or a startup conference, so you listen to other speakers. So I think just having breadth of interaction people, because when you're an academic, sometimes, Peter, and you know this as well as anyone, you're in your bubble. Let's say you're at Harvard Business School,
Yeah.
that's a very prestigious place, there's cool things happening, but there's actually a whole world outside that. You know what I mean?
Well, and I think
Sometimes forget
academics
that.
sometimes forget that is that they're fighting so hard to get that next paper
Yep.
published that 9 people are gonna read.
Yep.
3 of them have the same last name.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
no, well, I think that's good advice. Well, appreciate your time, and I thank you
Anytime,
for
Peter.
sharing time with us today, David. Thank you.
Likewise.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.